The response to remembrance of the narcissistic psychopath. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. A year ago, Doug Scott Kramer died. Doug and I had known each other for a number of years. He was a non-intimate secondary source in my fuel matrix. There may be some of you who find such a description of him jarring, but I'm telling you the truth of what he was. Like everybody else that I interact with, Doug was an appliance. I recognize, as a consequence of my cognitive empathy and higher executive function, that there is a time where somebody who has died, that it is appropriate to talk about them with respect, perhaps with fondness or reverence. I have learned that. I have also, as part of this channel, seen the necessity of enabling you to understand how it is that someone like me regards not only death, but the remembrance of a person's death. For some of you, you will undoubtedly find it unsettling, but that is to help you understand the way that someone such as me sees these matters. Doug and I had known each other for a number of years. We had many conversations, and I am posting some of those conversations and interviews again to enable you to look upon the exchanges that we had. Perhaps, as I understand that you are given to want, to pay your respects, to remember Doug with the fondness that I know many of you had for him. You have expressed as such. It will also enable you not only in going through this recollection, but have an opportunity to receive further education. Some of you may not have watched these interviews, and I would urge you to do so, as you get an interesting insight into the dynamic between me, a narcissistic psychopath, and an empath that was Doug. You also get to learn plenty about narcissism, Scientology, and the dynamic of the narcissist and empath. Accordingly, I would very much encourage you to watch those interviews as you remember Doug. Doug and I also spoke off the record, so to speak. Prior to the recordings, in between the recordings and after the recordings, we had a number of conversations. He invariably would be expressing his delight at the content of the interview or the opportunity to speak again. He was always enthused. He always exhibited kindness. This naturally demonstrated that he was under control, that he provided fuel to me, because, like anybody else, he was an appliance. Earlier, I posted a video in memoriam of Doug. Why might I do that? Well, this is done because I understand the need to demonstrate respect and remembrance for somebody that has died. There are many who die who deserve to die. There are individuals who by my own hand have been consigned to oblivion, and rightly so. They were little more than a blight upon this earth, and it was right and proper to disincentivize them. Those individuals ought to have no memory written in stone for them. They very much deserve to be eradicated, and the sooner that any memory of them crumbles and dissipates into the ether, many would say the better. For others, there is the necessity of remembrance. How is it that I have remembered Doug? Well, quite simply, I had made a note in my diary of the date of Doug's death. I understand that there are those who believe that he died a little earlier than the 11th of December. However, that is the date I understand that it is his official date of death, and therefore that is the date upon which I will use, and also in terms of remembering the date of that death. Thus, I entered it into my diary. Why did I do that? I did so because I wanted people to understand the dynamic that took place between Doug and myself, and also that I wanted to provide some form of short tribute to Doug to demonstrate the way in which someone like I would remember an individual, and also use the opportunity to teach you more about the way that I see this event. Essentially, as with everything that I do involving other people, I've utilised it for my own purposes. I recognise that it serves a dual purpose, because many people were very fond of Doug, enjoyed his outlook, enjoyed his exchanges with me, and as I have repeatedly observed, it is very much something about human beings that they wish to remember those who have died. They wish to spend time on the anniversary of those deaths, recalling their lives, recalling the relationship they had with them, cherishing memories, and therefore, in order to fit in with that and to provide to my viewers, I deemed that it was appropriate, as part of asserting control over my viewership, to mark the anniversary of Doug's death. Hence, the in memoriam tribute that was provided. Furthermore, I saw it as an opportunity to help you understand how someone such as I looks upon the issue of the anniversary of a death. I have known numerous people who have died. As mentioned, I have caused that. In other instances, they are people that I have known that have died as a consequence of something having happened to them, whether it is violence, or whether it is disease, or simply succumbing to old age. It is not the case that I necessarily mark each individual's passing away with a note in my schedule or diary. The reason for that is that in many instances, such as my memory, that I am able to recall when an individual has died. It is often a source of amusement to my friends, but I have such an ability to recall dates and times of when things have taken place. I'm able to recall the precise week in terms of dates of when I and a group of my friends from sixth form hired a cottage, for example, in the southwest of England at the end of our A-levels. I'm able to provide the date of the first Depeche Mode concert that I went to. I'm able to remember all of my friends' birthdays without the necessity of prompts. I'm able to remember that on this date 10 years ago, this happened or that happened, and I regularly remind my friends of those matters. It is not because I am someone that sits and reminisce. It is simply the way that my mind works, that events are committed to my memory along with a date and time. And when an anniversary of that comes along, I seem to have this ability to automatically be reminded and say to people, do you know that 4 years ago we were sat in that bar in Berlin? How do you remember that, they say. I just do. It is a function of what I am. And thus similarly, when it would have come to Doug, although I made a note in my schedule for the purposes of the preparation of videos, I would have remembered. Not because I would remember out of any emotion linked to fondness or sadness. Those are not emotions that I have. It is simply a cold and clinical recollection of an event. In the same way that my memory reminds me that it was 5 years since I departed from a particular property, or that it was 7 years since I ended a relationship with a particular individual, or that it was 6 months ago that I was in a particular place. My memory also would remind me that it was a year since Doug Kramer died. I've explained previously that death is invariably an irritation. It is not something whereby I am consumed by sadness, for that is not an emotion that I have. But rather, the death of certain individuals becomes an irritation because they contributed something to my life. It is not so much about the provision of fuel, for it is easy to replace people. I have an extensive fuel matrix, consisting of the primary source, the secondary sources, and the tertiary sources. Doug, as I mentioned earlier, was a non-intimate secondary source. I have many of those, and the loss of Doug as a non-intimate secondary source did not dent my fuel matrix, for there were plenty of other people that I could turn to fuel. Doug, of course, was easy to control. He came willingly. He wanted to speak to me. He interacted. He was respectful and interesting. There were certain character traits that I obtained from Doug, primarily in relation to his experiences of being involved in the cult of Scientology, his survivorship, and the experiences thereof which I could make use of in my work. The residual benefit, of course, provided by Doug was that we were able to collaborate together and create material which could then be used to extend my legacy and also to populate his channel also. Thus, he, like anybody else in my fuel matrix, served a purpose. Doug was part of the accumulation of people that is part of my psychopathy. But the main aspect of Doug that catered to me was stimulation. The fact that he asked interesting questions, that he had a particularly empathic outlook on life, which I found interesting, allied with his somewhat laissez-faire attitude towards life. The fact that he had been involved in Scientology, that he had been involved with numerous narcissists, that he wanted to understand more about narcissism, and that he was willing to share his experiences, much of which we talked about outside of the formal videos, all of which was stimulating to me. And thus, that was probably the most important aspect of the dynamic between Doug and myself, was the fact that he provided me with that stimulation. Death of an appliance is ordinarily met with irritation. This is because there is a loss of something that was useful. Only recently I have learned of the death of two people at comparatively young ages, both of them somewhat older than me, but people that I have known. An individual from my past that I kept in touch with who died of motor neurone disease at a comparatively young age in his mid-50s. Another individual who was a former colleague from long ago. He also died of some unspecified degenerative disease in his early 60s. They were not individuals that had a huge impact upon me, and, as you would expect, there is no sadness when I learn of their departure. The fact is that when I learn of them leaving, the response is actually a sensation of nothing. It is an acknowledgement. I recognize, as a consequence of my cognitive empathy, that in relation to those two individuals it is sad for their families, for their friends to have lost them at relatively young ages. But for me, I did not have the regularity of contact with them that I once did. Therefore, the purpose that they served for me had largely evaporated. Thus, when I was told that they had died, it was met with a simple acknowledgement. I understood and recognized what had happened, and felt nothing. In relation to Doug, the fact is that in the course of this year, it has not impacted upon the creation of my material other than I have lost somebody that would speak about Scientology and would bring a particular viewpoint. That was irritating. I understand that for many other people, they may find such a view odd, but that is the view that I have, because that is the way that I function. People are simply appliances to me, and Doug was no different. Yes, I have the capacity to talk in what you would regard as fond terms about people in order to manage my facade. I can do the right thing because I've learned what the right thing is to do. I can convey observations about somebody which are true and accurate, and those observations, as I did in the short in memoriam video to Doug, would undoubtedly cause people to think, that was good of you, HG. Understand that me knowing the right thing to do, being respectful, are once again the roads that lead to the necessary triad and the prime aims. It is always self-serving, and the death of a person and remembering them on the anniversary of that death is no different. Doug provided stimulation to me, and whilst that is no longer the case, there are plenty of others that provide that role also. He was not unique in that regard. But I've deemed it appropriate, for the reasons that I advanced, to provide that in memoriam in relation to Doug, because he was a main part of my channel. He was someone that I had spoken with on many occasions and at length. And therefore, that has a degree of importance to my work, to my channel, and therefore, I deem that it is appropriate to recognise that by marking the anniversary of his death. I do not sit and think on Doug with any sense of sadness or any particular sense of loss. The loss occurred a year ago. It does not endure. It is short-lived. I am able to remember what we talked about. It does not bring me happiness. It does not bring me a warm, prurient feeling to recall our exchanges. I simply remember and acknowledge. It is like so much data passing before my eyes. I recall the man that he was, and I also recognise, as a consequence of the many people that have contacted me, the way that he was well regarded by people. I understand that, and regard it as merited. Doug was a good person. Doug was a kind person. Doug was an empathic person. He provided something with regard to the extension of my legacy, and for that he earned my respect. For that he earned my favour. But it does not mean that I sit lamenting his loss. It does not mean that I sit in sadness, for those are things that I simply do not do. But ultimately, I recognise, through the lens of understanding other people, that it is appropriate to mark the contribution that he made. That is right and proper, for to do so, it once again serves my needs. I thought, therefore, that I would share with you the way that I look upon the 1-year anniversary of Doug's death, and to explain to you how I, as a narcissistic psychopath, have decided to mark it, and the reasons for doing so. I do this to help you further understand me and the way that my kind behave. I know from the discussions that I had with Doug that he was very keen for people to be helped in their understanding of narcissism. One of the ways that this was done, and Doug was a contributor himself, was to the Angel Assistance Fund. This is a fund that was established at the request of my readers of my blog, so that monies could be donated by people, so that those that were in need, wanting my assistance by way of audio consultation or narc detector, for example, or to obtain materials from the Knowledge Vault, such as how to handle a parental narcissist or divorcing a narcissist, what to expect, could be accessed by those that were experiencing financial difficulties. Doug felt that that was a worthwhile enterprise, and I make mention of it so that if you would like to perhaps donate to the Angel Assistance Fund, the link is in the video description, you may do so, and perhaps do so in tribute to Doug. This is how I look upon the remembrance of someone such as Doug, a year after he has died. There are many who never surface in my memory that, having been consigned to oblivion, they do not invade my consciousness ever again. There are others who will do so repeatedly, and Doug will be one of those individuals. In the course of the year, there have been times where he has just popped into my thoughts, or I have seen something that has reminded me of him. It is not the case that I pause and feel overcome with emotion and sadness as a consequence of that recollection, but I simply acknowledge it, remember him, and remember the interest in which I had in the conversations, and then I move on. It is momentary. But it is a testament to Doug's stimulation of me that he has that capacity still to be remembered, that he has not faded away like so many other people do, that he remains to have some relevance to me. Thus, I thought it would be useful for you to understand the way that I consider Doug now, the reasons behind the memoriam that has been created for him, and how I, H.G. Tudor, as a narcissistic psychopath, look upon these matters. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.